Hi there, listeners. Before we start the podcast today, I'd just like to give a few thanks. First of all, to the guys behind Nightmare.com for keeping the dream alive all these years, and to the guys behind Under Consultation, the Games Master podcast, for their inspiration and support. I'd also like to say thank you to my friend Andy M for letting me bounce ideas off of him, and to Nikki and Bunty for just generally being fantastic human beings. But most of all today, I want to say thank you to the wonderful Mary Miller, a fantastic actress who will be sorely missed. Welcome, listeners of Illusion, to Temporal Discussion, a brand new podcast retrospective of the best kids' TV show ever made, Nightmare. I am one of your hosts, Martin Harder, and before you ask, yes, I was mercilessly bullied at school.
And my name's Martin O'Doney, and I swear I wasn't. I was really popular at school. Everybody loved me, and nobody ever tried to pick on me. Obviously, they didn't, and I still got the scars. Sorry, carry on. I'm 45 years old and I've been a Nightmare fan since I was 12, so I should probably know better by now. Welcome.
What year did it start? Was it 1987, wasn't it?
It was. And I'm ashamed to know my age was already in double digits even then.
I would have been 4, so that would make it one of my earliest memories, is sitting down and watching Nightmare.
Good heavens. It's definitely not one of my earliest memories, but it's definitely one of my most vivid memories of watching TV as a kid. I can say that. I was bloody terrified by it a lot of the time, but you know how it is with kids at that age, they actually love being frightened.
Oh yes, of course.
It's only parents who really think that scary TV is bad for kids. The kids themselves adore it. It's a way of having fun. So
it's a similar effect as going on a roller coaster, isn't it?
Yes.
You're scared, but you know that nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't. I was absolutely blooming terrified of the entire thing. Nightmare was really my Doctor Who. It was my hide behind the sofa.
It started just a couple of years before the original Doctor Who came to an end. So in many ways, it was quite well timed, because that is basically the market that it filled to a large extent, as kids approaching teenage years in the main, or just into their teenage years, and they want something, they want a bit of fantasy that's got a bit of an edge to it. And the fact that Nightmare, as we shall explore our first episode, actually went as far as into pseudo killing off its contestants.
Oh,
that's an edge.
Yes.
That is an edge. That is an edge. It was very, very daring for kids' TV. Let's say that. There's elements that are very similar to the adventure game. I don't know how many people remember the adventure game.
I had heard of it. I only actually caught an episode recently when Ashens was streaming some old Sunday night television.
Yeah.
And there was an episode of the adventure game, I believe it had Graham Gardner on it.
It also had the newsreader Moira Stewart on it for a long time as well. It was very odd. It had the same, like Nightmare, it was a puzzle solving game. You had to go on a strange kind of journey. It was more like a science fiction maze rather than Nightmare has a dungeon, but it was a sci-fi maze in the adventure game, and the contestants could get vaporized on a thing called the vortex in that. So I think that's where some of the ideas in Nightmare came from.
Well, we've got a Crystal Maze experience in London. Maybe it's time to get Nightmare experience as well.
Well, Nightmare is a stage show these days, of course, isn't it? So in some ways, we've already got it back, and you and I work on very occasionally these days, work on an audio drama team that make plays based on the series as well. So it's not really gone. It's still out there, but a proper official one, with Tim Child, the producer, on board, and preferably with Hugo Myatt still hosting it. Although he's, by his own admission, he's getting a bit too old for it now. But I think he's still the man. That sort of real official lineup would be great. I hope we haven't lost anybody who's a bit new tonight.
So, Martin.
Yes, Martin.
It's going to get really confusing.
Like the Monty Python sketch of all the Bruces.
Michael Baldwin Bruce.
I'm impressed. You were gonna ask me something.
So, Martin, can you tell us a bit about Nightmare?
So one of the things about it was when it the first time the credits rolled, well, the titles rolled, I should say, way back in Monday, the something or other of September 1987. I can't remember what the date was.
I actually have it in my notes here. It's
oh, really?
Monday, September the 9th, 1987.
That sounds right, yeah.
It was actually September the 7th, and I'm genuinely quite embarrassed that I got that wrong. Rick Astley was number one.
Was he? What was the hit? Of course it was. As I was saying, September 1987, first time the titles rolled, it didn't actually make clear to you when they were announcing it that you're actually watching a game show. And so when you're watching it, the first thing that the host, Treguard, played brilliantly by Hugo Myatt, absolutely perfect for the role. He speaks to the camera, so at this point you realize it's not necessarily going to be a drama show, but at the same time he's talking to the camera in character as a medieval dungeon master. And so you're not sure exactly what you're watching at this point. And the effect is kind of brain phasing because you're wondering, is he going to do a documentary about medieval history or something? Yeah, so you're not sure exactly what you've come across here. And then he brings in the first contestant, the Dungeoneer, as they call it, a very nicely made up word. The Dungeoneer is just a kid from the modern world, dressed up in a t-shirt, jeans, rather very, very 80s, slightly fluffy hairstyle. And at that point, you're still not sure what you're watching, incredibly. At this point, it could still be some kind of weird documentary. You don't know. He gives you this rather long rundown, then, of what's ahead. So you're going on a quest, and it gives you all the rules of the dungeon. The Dungeoneer starts a quest. They appear in this computer-generated dungeon. Well, I say computer-generated. It was actually mainly hand-drawn, and then the drawings were scanned into an Amiga computer at the time. And using chroma key, the Dungeoneer actually appears to be in this chamber that's been hand-drawn. He's wearing a helmet. A helmet's been given to him with horns sticking out the side. Some people think that makes it a Viking helmet. That is not true. Vikings did not have horns in their helmets. But the helmet is got this kind of... The front visor, it goes all the way down, way over the eyes, over the nose. So, of course, they can't actually see ahead. To compensate for not having the eyesight, there are 3 advisors as well who the host brings in. They can see the completed image of the Dungeoneer in the chroma key room, and they just describe it to the Dungeoneer and then give them guidance so they can walk around the room, because otherwise they'll bump into things. Yeah,
it's sort of almost like an early form of virtual reality. And speaking of virtual reality, we will get to that at some point later on in the series.
But for better or worse, virtual reality did get did get a bigger and bigger role in Nightmare. So, but basically the dungeon had 3 levels, each one a bit more dangerous and a bit more difficult to get through than the previous one. A level would, on average, would have about 7 or 8 rooms in it. Sometimes less, sometimes more, that sort of thing. The way the dungeon works, it's a magical dungeon, and that means that when you walk, there's no one pathway through it, and the pathway through it changes, and so the rooms keep on appearing in different quests in completely different orders.
It almost gave the you were saying about Rogue. It almost gave the impression that it was procedurally generated, although it wasn't.
No, it was actually a lot more linear than the way it was presented made it look. It was known as the toughest game show on television, because it was, and as I say, if you failed to win it, you would suffer a rather grisly computer-generated death. So that's what Nightmare was all about.
And so, without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Welcome, Watchers of Illusion, to the Castle of Confusion. Phase with us now, for this is the time of adventure.
So here's where we meet Tregard for the first time. And you've already said a little bit about how it made you feel seeing Tregard. For me, I was at an age where suspension of disbelief wasn't a thing for me. As far as I was aware, this was actually happening somewhere. These kids were going into this dungeon, getting killed, and then coming back to life.
I was a little different. I didn't realise, at this point, I didn't realise it was actually all being recorded months earlier. I didn't think it was actually happening live, but I was thinking each episode was being recorded during the week of broadcast. So it wasn't that different for me. And I wasn't completely sure that it was computer generated either. Looking at it now, it's painfully obvious that a lot of the images were hand-drawn. But at that point, because it was so advanced for the graphics of the time, I actually wasn't sure what was graphics and what was real.
And we should say a lot of that is down to David Rowe. That artwork is amazing.
Fantastic. The early seasons were darker and more surreal than some of the later ones. And the main reason for that was David Rowe. He really created something that was otherworldly, but the contestants could fit into. It was genius. Absolute genius.
Tregard.
Oh, him.
Yeah.
Forgot about him.
I remember finding him very imposing.
Oh, yes. And I thought that was actually something that was rather taken away from him later on. But during the early seasons, he was a sadist. And there was moral ambiguity about him in the early years, where it was quite clear he was entirely a neutral referee as well as a host. He was refereeing the game, as it were. He was neutral, and he also seemed to really enjoy seeing the Dungeoneers in danger.
My wife actually had a theory about that. We were watching it together last night. She remembers as Nightmare went on and the budgets got better, Tregard became less scruffy looking and more regal looking. So her theory is that he's actually feeding off the kid's deaths somehow. Basically, what she's saying is each time a kid dies, Tregard experiences the quickening.
That's an interesting theory. I've often thought the whole thing about the life force clock, which we'll go into later, showed that the dungeon is actually feeding off of the contestants. That's an idea I've always had, but I never actually looked at it as being Tregard. But if he did absorb from the kids, that might also affect the way he saw his allegiance as well. So yeah.
So is Tregard a physical embodiment of the dungeon?
Well, the way he introduces himself, he says he is the only one who's ever mastered the dungeon. But who knows what effect that might have had on him. There was a novel based on the series which basically tells a story of how he mastered the dungeon. It doesn't seem to give any indication of anything like that, but then you don't have to assume that the novel is literally canonical if you don't want to. The idea is a brilliant one, I have to say. I've never really looked at it that way.
Tregard indicates towards an archway, which he claims is a portal to the Dungeon of Deceit, which he alone has mastered, as we were saying earlier. He then tells us that those of us who have crossed the boundaries of time must also master it. So far, so vague. But Tregard doesn't waste any more time and quickly calls our first Dungeoneer.
The first is now without, so enter, stranger.
And our first challenger is David Campbell, who, when questioned, tells Tregard that he has some experience as a Dungeoneer and is seeking knighthood. Tregard tells him that this will not be possible, as defeating the dungeon will reward him with the silver spurs of squiredom, which is only the first step towards knighthood. Tregard reminds David that he may have 3 advisors and that he should call them now.
David, James, Lucien, come!
This is the part that it's really going to get confusing because there's a Dungeoneer called David and there's an advisor called David. And it's really confusing when someone has the same name. Isn't that right, Martin?
The Bruce phenomenon again, yes. That is right, Martin. What do you think, Martin?
Well, Martin, the standout here is advisor David, who seems to be the voice of the team for the most part.
He does look a little bit startled when he realizes the camera is on him. Oh my God, this is actually a television program, he seems to be thinking. Oh.
Incidentally, if you're listening out there and you are David, James, or Lucien, get in touch and tell us we're wrong, because we're quite happy to be proven wrong. Details at the end of the show. My wife pointed out when we watched it last night that Lucien has a very River Phoenix Stand By Me look about him.
Yeah, I haven't really noticed that before. I'd say the thing I'm noticing when I watch them, I'm quite impressed with how assertive they are when they're being introduced. You look at some of the teams right up to the very end of the very final season. A lot of them are extremely camera shy. I saw an American review of Nightmare a few years ago, and he said most of the Dungeoneers and advisors are just a bunch of stiffs, which I thought was a bit rough. A lot of these kids are only 10, 11 years old, so go easy on them, mate. I was thinking, but yeah. Yeah, I think these ones, they speak loudly, they speak clearly. Give them kudos for that, because as I said, they'd only been about 12 years old at the time. Like me, they must be in their 40s now.
Traegard doesn't seem too impressed, saying that he's sure they'll do, but if they don't, then somebody will find it amusing. Probably him at this point.
Yes, I would agree with that. Traegard is definitely the guy who's going to find it amusing. Probably Mogdred as well. Mogdred is the arch villain in the early years. We'll come to him another time, because he doesn't actually appear in season 1, even though he's written into it. He's frequently mentioned by Merlin throughout the first season. But the problem is, all the teams at this point have so little idea what they're doing that none of them can actually get far enough to meet him. So that was the reason. But the character was invented for season 1. He was written into scripts. It's just the problem of wasted material in the scripts has often been complained about by Tim Child himself. Lots of scripts never got used because the contestants were just not good enough to actually get far enough. And everything for Mogdred, all that stuff that poor John Woodnut, the actor who played Merlin and Mogdred, all that stuff he had to learn, pages and pages of it, he ended up never actually performing because the quests never got that far.
Now, to matters of the most serious. David, your quest through the dungeon is for truth and justice. Justice, of course, is blind. And when you don this helmet, you also become blind. Although you'll find there's just enough vision to examine and collect objects from directly beneath.
So, this is where we're introduced to the Helmet of Justice, which is essentially, it's just a big blindfold. We're also introduced to the knapsack, which is sort of a substitute stomach. The life force clock, which we get a look at here as well. It's kind of going to say, like in an awful lot of computer video games, you often have a life force bar, which tells you how much strength your character has left in the game. This life force clock is actually sort of follows the character through the dungeon, and it's your in-game life force rather than your accumulation of real injuries that you're getting.
I just say that animation.
It made me very uneasy. I think I was probably a bit too old to actually be terrified by it, but it is very effective. It is very effective. The knapsack is your pseudo stomach for keeping the life force clock topped up, so to speak.
If you haven't seen the Life Force clock, which most of you would have because you're listening to this podcast, imagine a face with the skin slowly peeling away to reveal a skull.
Yeah, it starts out. It's actually an image of the Dungeoneer wearing a helmet. For some reason, it's a different shaped helmet. It doesn't have the horns on it, but it's got the helmet. The helmet slowly bits and pieces fall off it until the whole thing's gone. During the helmet stage, it's got a green background because your life force is considered to be condition green, which means it's healthy. After the helmet's gone, it becomes amber, the background, and that's when the skin starts to peel off in big clumps. It sounds nastier than it actually is, I should stress it. Graphics at the time were too limited to actually make it really bloody and really gory or anything, but it was still very effective. And then when all the skin had gone, you've got a skull with the eyeballs still rolling around inside it, looking really, really helpless and scared. And then bits of the skull start to fall off, a bit removed from the crown. The jaw falls off, and then a big mass of the skull just moves away. It actually goes past the camera, so to speak, and you've just got the eyeballs left. Whilst the skull's there, life force is condition red, which means you're not healthy. It means you're actually in danger. It's life force critical, I think is the phrase that's normally used. And when the eyeballs then drift past the camera as well, once they're gone, you're dead. You're dead. That's what nearly got this program into trouble with Mary Whitehouse, but that's a story for another day.
Do you still wish to enter the quest?
Yes, I do.
Very well. Turn then. Face the door and take a step forward.
Traegard guides the Dungeoneer David towards the portal, and the quest is underway.
Where am I? You're in a reasonably large room.
So the first challenge is a relatively simple one. Step on the letters in order to spell open. However, despite several massive hints from Traegard, it takes these kids ages to work it out.
I was saying earlier, the early seasons were darker and more surreal, and there's a lot to be said for that. But the downside of the early years is, especially because the teams hadn't been able to watch Nightmare themselves. The teams in the first season especially had this problem. They didn't really know what they were doing, and the teams, especially in the first season, were painfully slow to watch sometimes. The chamber itself, this is often called the four-door chamber. That's a name that, as far as I can tell, fans have given it, because I don't think it ever had an official title. But you see it an awful lot in the first 3 seasons. The doors often have different things. Right here, we got portcullises. Sometimes it has clues, images of clues on it or something. Sometimes got quest object images appearing on it, so you can choose which quest you're going on. There's all sorts of things that appear in that chamber. As you say, this team seemed to take an absolute eternity just to realise that the letters spell open. I have tried to defend them so far on the grounds that they're young, but they're not that young. And but it then takes them another 2 or 3 minutes to actually realise that you're supposed to walk over the letters and then to actually do it as well.
And it's the fact Treguard is practically...
He's told them how to do it!
Yeah.
He's told them how to do it. Get on with it, boys. Come on!
I also want to say at this point that Advisor David has clearly been told by his mum that he's going on television and he must speak properly.
Yes. His accent turns irretrievably posh in a number of sentences. You actually think this business about knighthood, his mum probably thought he was genuinely going to meet the Queen. I can't think of another explanation, really. But yeah, it's ludicrously slow. I think it takes them something like 3 minutes to get out of this chamber, even allowing for the newness of it. You look at it in hindsight after watching later seasons of it, and you do think, oh, come on, get on with it.
So they did eventually manage to open one of the portcullises and leave the room, and then moved on to something that would become a staple of Nightmare.
Where am I? You're in a smallish room with a door in the wall in front of you and a door in the wall to your right. There is a table in the middle of the room.
This is a relatively empty room with a table in the centre and an exit to the right. On the table are a meat pie.
There's no I in team, but there is an I in pie. There's an I in meat pie. The anagram of meat is team. I don't know what he's talking about. Look, that's it.
Which goes straight into Dungeoneer David's knapsack. But Treguard warns the team that they have delayed too long and a manifestation is now occurring. Our first wall monster appeared, and Treguard explains that they delight in stupidity.
They must be very fond of themselves.
And they must be defeated with wits. In this case, this means
answering riddles.
Okay, there's a lot to comment on here. First things first, that's a little speech from Treguard. I think anybody who sits through season 1 in one long binge watch, you're going to be banging your head against the wall listening to it after a while, because he says it in literally every single quest, and it really starts to get up your nose after about the 4th episode. That's one problem. The other thing about it was because he always gives that speech about delaying too long in this chamber, some of the Dungeoneers, they actually quickly get to the table and actually quickly put the food in their knapsack after a few seconds. They actually it's very clear what you've got to do. Go and do it, and that's what they do. And he still says, you've delayed too long in this chamber. Shut up! They haven't even had a chance to work out what the objects are yet, and you're already telling them you've delayed too long in this chamber.
They've got this blindfold on. It's not like they're going to speed run it.
Exactly. But thankfully, for the next couple of seasons, they dropped that ridiculous bit about you've been hanging around in the chamber too long, because it's clearly not true.
I am Olgoth of legend. I have riddles of different kinds, of different legends. 3 riddles have I, and truth is what I seek. 1 truth will pass you on, 2 may aid you, 3 commands me. Fail all 3, and I feed on you.
Olgoth tells us that he'll allow David to pass with 1 correct answer, 2 will earn him a clue, 3 will give him the power to command the monster, and no correct answers will result in him being consumed. Treguard then goes on to say pretty much exactly the same thing.
At least in later quests, you got the excuse, well, this team wasn't there when I said it previously. You could still say it completely differently in a million ways. But to actually repeat it during the same quest, immediately after somebody else has said the same thing. Again, not wise, not good television there, not good television. Just mention, by the way, I always remember the original War Monster as being Granitas. So every time I watch episode 1 of season 1, it keeps making me jump when I hear him say he's Olgarth. For some reason, it always pops back into my head. And yes, everybody at home, including other people who've never heard it before, we know what Granite Arse sounds like.
We will get on to that later on.
Yeah. It's supposed to be a pun on gravitas, but suggests other things. The series itself makes a big deal about that too. But yeah, it's just, I don't want to mention, for some reason, Granitas is the more famous of the original 2 War Monsters, and so I think that's the reason why I keep on thinking he's the first one. He actually isn't, it's Olgarth. It keeps catching me out, that. I don't know why.
And so we have our first riddle.
Of earth I was born, deep fires tempered me, mountains slept on me. My father was younger than I, and a sculptor gave me my face. What am I made of?
Pretty easy, this one.
It is a very obvious one, and I got it immediately when I was 12 years old, and that is not a boast. That is purely reflected on the fact it's a bloody easy riddle to answer.
And to be fair, so did this team.
They did get this one. They're not that bad. Just mentioning about Olgarth, his appearance on the wall here is very, very poorly done. In later quests, the image of the War Monster is a lot clearer. He's very faint here, to the extent that it's actually possible to only just notice him materializing. To the best of my knowledge, the effect is done by the actor actually wearing that face over in the form of a mask. And then there's a camera zoomed in immediately in front of him, and then the resulting image is chroma keyed onto into the computerized chamber.
I just assumed it was a hand puppet.
Well, I'm not sure. That was what I originally thought. This is the reason why here I think it may actually be a mask. Is because when you listen to him speaking here, there's something strange that happens when he's speaking. He keeps on making this sudden sucking noise, and the mask actually gets pulled inwards into his mouth as he's doing it, which makes me think actually it may have been a mask there, and he's actually having trouble breathing through it. I may be wrong. It may be a puppet. I've never actually been able to find out for sure, but the way it's done there, you notice on several occasions go like that. It actually does sound like he's sucking through the mask. So that's why I think it may actually be a mask. It was a constant problem throughout the first 2 seasons with the War Monsters that their image keeps sliding up and down the wall, and so in the 3rd season they actually changed the way that the War Monsters were presented altogether. Again, we'll come back to that in another podcast.
So on to our next riddle.
Made like me, the mountain stands, the tallest object in our land. Give name to him.
The him is a nice clue. Without him saying that, the riddle actually becomes ambiguous, I should say, because it depends what you mean by our land. If you mean Britain, then the answer is Ben Nevis. If you mean England, it's actually Scafell Pike. The fact that he says give name to him makes it Ben Nevis, but without it could be
also
ambiguous.
He says our land. There is nothing to state that they are anywhere in England or the United Kingdom.
It's just as well. It's certainly just as well it wasn't a Welsh or Scottish team there, or an Irish team, because otherwise they might have got a little bit peeved about that, and with good reason, I should say.
I will say though, even if you don't know the answer, don't just repeat the first answer.
I was coming to that, yeah. That was pretty dumb that they just went and then repeated that. So I don't want to be nasty to them but that was pretty silly to just assuming it will be the same answer again. You are allowed to give more than one different answer.
Nervous kids panicking a little.
It could be. I think the pressure of when Olgar started shouting at them to name the answer in a hurry may have affected them. But just give any answer. Don't give the same.
So far they're 1 out of 2. So 50%.
It isn't terrible.
Third riddle.
Once by magic I was cleft. Deep in my chest a sword was left. 10 years of pain I endured. Then came a prince who pulled it forth. Name him now.
No, it's too easy, that one, really, isn't it? Producer Tim Child, he has a lot of love for Nightmare, but there were many aspects of it that he wasn't happy with, and one of the ones that he got increasingly unhappy with in the early seasons was how derivative Nightmare was of Arthurian legend. The fact that Merlin is one of the characters in it, the fact that Mogdred is basically a corruption of Mordred. There was also in the 3rd season there was an appearance by a couple of appearances by a sorceress called Morgana, which is clearly just a corruption of Morgana. So he got increasingly unsatisfied with himself for constantly using Arthurian sources. But he also did it with a number of the riddles as well, and this was one of them. And it's too easy.
We say that riddle is easy, but that's only because we know the answer. Any question or any riddle that you don't know the answer to is a difficult one.
I suppose, yeah. But the point is, I was being taught the Arthurian legends before I started school. I realise that's not going to be the same for everybody, but I'd imagine by the time you're old enough to be a contestant on Nightmare, you must have at least a rough idea.
Yeah, even if you've not started doing Arthurian legends at school at that point, you've probably seen Disney's The Sword and the Stone.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
2 is the score. Olgarth informs them that justice lies on the right, but he who seeks it must be fleet of foot. Tregard reminds them to take some objects, so they choose to take the ruby and a charm.
What does it say about them that they thought they weren't allowed them after they just solved the riddles that gave them the rights to take them? Oh well. Again, we've got to be fair to them that they'd never seen Nightmare. It's obvious when you've watched every other quest that's ever been done.
Where am I?
Quickly. David, you're in a smallish room. There are 2 exits. You just came through one. There's another one to your left.
There's a bomb lighted, David. Okay, you might...
And straight into a bomb room. Not much to describe here, really. It's a room with a big bomb in it.
Yes, and we might as well say it. So was the next one.
Yeah.
I do have a comment to make about the bomb rooms, though, which is they weren't well done in the first 2 seasons. They were very badly animated to begin with. So what you basically had, it was 1 frame every 4 or 5 seconds. Frame changes, and suddenly the fuse has gone down a quarter of the length. And then another 4 seconds, and it goes down another quarter. But also, even worse, sometimes it would suddenly jump back, and the fuse would suddenly grow back to the previous length.
Yes, thank you. I thought I'd imagined that.
No, well, believe me, I'm sure everybody who's watched Nightmare has noticed that. It does it so often in the first 2 seasons that it's gone down, it's really close to running out of fuse, and suddenly it jumps backwards, and suddenly it's like the fuse has suddenly grown, suddenly an extra bit of fuse has suddenly just uncoiled out of the bomb, and it's suddenly gone backwards again.
I personally just have never liked bomb rooms.
I can understand that.
I understand that it's there to just get things moving, to add a sense of danger.
It's a threat, but it's not really a floor puzzle.
No, and they're just so cartoony looking.
Yeah, I think the problem we've got is it's okay. It does look cartoony. You might as well have something written on the side of the bomb saying 200 pounds TNT or something. Maybe Acme, so that you've got the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote effect from it completed. Because I'm sure there must have been at least a couple of Roadrunner cartoons where Wile E. Coyote uses a bomb fuse like that. There may have been sticks of dynamite, but it's the same difference, really, isn't it? And it gets worse in ones where they do get blown up, because on those occasions, the fuse just shoots down in the space of about 2 seconds, and then bang. So
I'd just like to remind listeners that we do like this show.
What, Nightmare? Yeah, I do actually. But it's these little flaws in it that you notice or you allow yourself to notice in adulthood. You don't allow yourself to notice them when you're a kid. You try to ignore them. You try to pretend to yourself they're not there when you're a kid. But yeah, it was done better in later seasons. I think that's fair.
And I will say here that I think this is a problem that a lot of teams, especially early teams, had with maneuverability. Even though there was this threat, this giant bomb with a lit fuse, they still took blooming ages. So if either David is just casually describing the room as this fuse is going down.
Yes. I do sometimes wonder whether they did the second bomb room so they could do it well. So you can get okay, we let you get away with that one. I sometimes think Tim Chodd, yeah, okay, we let you get away with that one, but we want you to do it properly this time. So I'm going to give you another bomb room for you to get to. Oh God Almighty! That's as good. Once again, that's as good a theory as I've ever come up with for why we suddenly got 2 bomb rooms in a row.
It does seem that they actually slowed the fuse down on the second bomb room just so they would get through.
Yeah, they do it routinely though. So the only times when they don't slow it down is when they intend to actually make the bomb go off. Then the fuse just flies down to the end very quickly.
And now we move on to the next chamber.
Where am I?
David, you're in a rocky cavern. You're standing on the edge of a chasm, right? So don't move. A chasm, sorry. Now, at the top of the cavern, there is a serpent's head, and across the chasm is a woman.
Warning, team. She commands here. She will not tolerate my presence. Even as I speak, she rejects me. She rejects me.
Be gone!
So we emerge inside Lilith's chamber. Lilith rejects Traegard's presence and states that she doesn't take kindly to visitors, especially ones as unsuitably attired as Dungeoneer David. She even tries to coax David into walking into the chasm, or Chassim.
Whenever I see that, I start humming Snooker Loopy whenever I'm watching that scene. Chassim Dave. And he's called David as well, just to make it perfect.
Okay, I've got him written down as Advisor David here, but I'm going to keep calling him Chasm Dave now.
Yeah, it's perfect, isn't it? It's too good an opportunity not to. Chasm Dave.
If you're listening, Chasm Dave, I'm very, very sorry, but it is quite funny.
For some small consideration, I might just spare you and allow you to leave through the serpent's mouth. Have you anything that might interest me?
The
David?
ruby, Jock. Offer the ruby.
I've got the ruby. A ruby! Oh, bring it to me. Hurry, boy, hurry!
Don't move.
Oh, wait. First, I must summon the causeway.
However, Lilith does change her mind pretty quickly when offered the ruby that David is carrying, and she forms a bridge of ice so that Dungeoneer David may cross into the serpent's mouth. So this is the first time we meet Lilith, played brilliantly by the late Mary Miller. Just absolutely fantastic. Everything about her, just pure pantomime villain. And I was terrified of her as a child, and I still slightly am.
You wimp. First to say, Mary Miller was terrific, both at Lilith and in season 2, which she also played Mildred the Witch.
Yes.
She was fantastic in both roles. Brilliant actress. Absolutely perfectly cast again.
Excellent Shakespearean actress as well. I believe she played Lady Macbeth opposite Ian McKellen.
I imagine she did it in the same style as well, because it's the perfect style to play Lilith, albeit you need a Scottish accent. But the actual character of Lilith, though, I think it's one of those characters Nightmare probably wouldn't get away with today, because she is a hell of a stereotype on feminine vanity, the supposed assumption that women are always in love with shiny trinkets. I think that CITV, if it was being made today, they'd ask Tim Child to write to the character a bit differently there, because it does make her look painfully superficial.
Oh, totally agree.
And that's a shame, because, as I say, Mary Miller was such a good actress. She deserved better than that. Give her due. She played the role for all it was worth. She's the first on-screen dungeon character. It's a very significant moment, and I think it was for the good of the series that she was the one playing the first on-screen dungeon character, because, as I say, she really put everything into every line, and that arguably distracted from the fact that she was actually playing a bit of a stereotype.
It was a very of the time character. But she was also one of the few characters to actually hold any power over Traegard.
She may have accepted David's presence, but she did not accept Traegard's. And that actually is genuinely what makes a dungeon character terrifying. It's the same with Mogdred in later times. He often was able to exert power on Traegard as well. And the fact that we're talking about the dungeon master, and yet there's characters in the dungeon that can actually exert power over him, that makes those dungeon characters much more frightening. So if they can do that to the guy who actually mastered the dungeon, what can he do, or what can she do to the dungeoneer? And that made her doubly effective. So it was actually a very clever bit of writing, allowing her to be able to to cast Traegard out of the Serpent's Lair. It made her a very effective presence. Maximum points to the way she was performed, even if you have to deduct points for the way it was written.
I also want to say at this point, I know we've spoken about David Rowe's artwork, but here it's just amazing.
It's beautiful. It really is. It definitely became part of the geography of my mind, so to speak. The serpent's mouth cavern. Even when Lilith was written out of the series, they actually retained the cavern because it was such a beautiful and such a striking bit of work. And everything about it speaks of threat. It's an ice cavern. You could freeze to death if you're stuck here very long. There's this massive pit you can fall down. You're standing on an icy ledge, which presumably can break up very easily, and Lilith would often break it up and send dungeoneers down to their deaths. Lilith herself is such a powerful dungeon character. She can throw the dungeon master out of the chamber. The only way out of the chamber is shaped like the head of a snake, a gigantic snake. It absolutely speaks of threat in every angle, and it really, really underlines what a genius artist David Rowe was and still remains.
Farewell! Turn left. Quick, turn left. Right a bit. Forward. Where am I?
Right, David, you're...
Warning, team. No sooner do I take my eyes off you than you blunder into the great corridor of the catacomb. This is patrolled by the army of the dead. Exit with haste, or your quest ends now.
Right, David, you heard me, did you? You heard him, did you?
Dungeoneer David is now standing in a wide corridor. Treguard informs the team that this is the Great Corridor de Catacomb. Although it only has 4 rooms leading off it before it reaches a dead end, it doesn't seem particularly great. It does, however, look very lavender.
Yes, this is the great lie of the early seasons of Nightmare. It's the Great Corridor of the Catacomb. It is so massively overblown by Treguard almost every time the Dungeoneer arrives in it, and he always talks about it like they've made a mistake by going in there. But the truth of the matter is, the threat is always completely negligible. It's just a lavender corridor, or maybe sometimes it's lit up green, and it's got a strange monster at the far end, which looks like something cross between a frog and a crocodile. Or sometimes it's got a shadow demon standing at the back of it, but it can't actually approach the Dungeoneer, so it doesn't actually present a threat to the Dungeoneer. There is never a threat in the corridor of the catacomb. The way Treguard talks about it, you think a nuclear missile is on its way. You think that King Kong is going to emerge from one of the portals and come lurching down the corridor towards it. It never happens. The Dungeoneer always just walks to a door and goes through it. That's it.
They do in later series use the same backdrop for a much more effective threat.
Yeah.
But the corridor of the catacombs itself, not really that great.
A lot of fuss about very little. Again, can we please make clear to the listeners, we do like the programme, really. We do. But again, it's a flaw.
But Treguard does inform us that the army of the dead patrol here, and it is best not to dwell. Basically, the threat at this point is a sound effect.
Yeah, it's a sound of marching footsteps. There is something, because of the limitations at this point, there is a certain element of tell, don't show when trying to address the threat of the dungeon. It is genuinely a deadly place, the dungeon, but it can't often be shown on screen. And so that's why you have Treguard talking things up sometimes and not really convincing as much as you'd like him to.
Each doorway has a symbol on the floor in front of it, and the nearest door on the left matches the symbol on the charm that Dungeoneer David is holding. Dungeoneer David is guided to take the door matching the symbol on the charm.
I like the bit when one of the advisors says, "Enter that door." He can't see it! Haven't we established that yet? We do like the programme, though.
We do like the programme, and we understand that the kids on it were nervous and doing their best. David emerges into a very dark room. We can literally see David and a small amount of wall and floor space. As the advisors discuss amongst themselves what to do next, Treguard explains,
You should have taken the magic lamp when you had the chance. It would have been enough to have remembered the symbol. Now I can do nothing for you, even if I wished. This darkness is caused by something which doesn't like intruders. Even now it's making its dislike felt. Look at your life force clock. Condition red.
David?
Yeah?
Hold the charm up.
The clue that you could have just remembered the symbol but leave it on the table, that's a bit iffy. I just think if you're rejecting a clue object, it doesn't really follow that you then remember what it looked like and follow that image. It sounds incongruous to me. I have to say, Nightmare was amazing for its time. It was a very expensive program to make, and it was extremely cutting edge. But as a first death scene, this is a little bit cheap. Because basically you've got a black, half the screen is black. It's very obviously the Wellway room. Anybody who's seen later Nightmare will recognise that doorway as the doorway that leads into the Wellway chamber. But all they've actually done for creating a threat here is just half the screen is black. So it's not exactly creating a particularly impressive special effect there.
It's another one that's just done with mostly sound effect, which, in fairness, is a particularly creepy sound effect.
It is. But at the same time, there's just a slight element of tell, don't show there, which is always, on TV, is always slightly weak. But we have to say, you get a lot of the life force clock to show the ending, and that really is effective. And that arguably does distract from the fact that the actual portrayal of the chamber is a bit half-hearted.
And there's some version of the theme tune, which I don't think we hear again.
We hear it once more. In fact, I think it's twice more. We hear it at the end of the season,
of course, yes.
when we first see Level 3. I call it the Level 3 anthem because of that. I think it's used again the first time you see Level 3 in Season 2 as well.
But it's never used again for the life force clock.
It's never used as a death knell. It's replaced with the chimes of the bell. But here, I actually do think you're right. I do think it's more effective using this anthem, but it does use up a lot of time. And I suspect that if they kept on using it every time, the effectiveness would rapidly
and
away.
The chimes themselves did also become synonymous with Nightmare as well.
Yeah, and the chimes, they're louder and they're very sudden, so they have a more shock effect. So in many ways it does make more sense using them instead of this anthem.
I also have my own theory about this particular death. I feel that part of it was because they wanted a 1-episode quest to start the series with, to kind of show this is how this works. This is what we're going on with from the time being.
That's possible. I must say that's possible, because that would explain that issue I mentioned from the previous chamber about the charm. If you're rejecting it as a clue, why would you remember what it looks like? That feels incongruous, so therefore perhaps they were being set up a little bit to fail. But at the same time, they did get to the end of the level. So my feeling is that they could easily, if they'd gone on further, they could easily have portrayed that just by cutting out bits from individual rooms. I mean, we were saying earlier, this team's handling of the first room was atrocious. even allowing for inexperience, it was atrocious. They could have easily cut probably a minute out of that just by cutting away from the chamber more often and then going back to it further down the line. They could have cut away from the chamber, had a picture of the advisors, and then cut back with more of the puzzle done at that point, and that would have saved a few minutes.
Oh dear, what a pity. Never mind.
Treguard explains that Dungeoneer David has come to a very sticky end, but if they're worried about what they're going to say to David's parents, then they needn't be, because although David perished in the dungeon, he has survived in our dimension.
That shocked me when I first saw it. Even though I'd seen the adventure game years earlier, I'd more or less forgotten it by that point, and I'd certainly forgotten the business about people being evaporated. So I was shocked when I saw a portrayal of death, but at the same time, it really drew me in, especially Treguard's reaction to it. He seemed so utterly unconcerned when he said,
almost
"Never mind."
smirking.
Yes. At best, he was disinterested. At worst, he was bloody loving it. And you couldn't quite tell which one it was. And even though I was only 12 years old, I was really, really engrossed by that. I was really drawn in by it. And I thought, wow, this guy is amazing. He was already one of my all-time favourite TV characters. And I'd only known him for about 19 minutes. That's how great it was.
Time now for you to join him. Spellcasting. DISMISS.
I've got in my notes here that the showing the Dungeoneers safe and sound was also an important part of the show. As we were saying earlier, the tabloids had a field day with Nightmare.
They did.
And they went straight to Mary Whitehouse, the well-known crusader for decency, and told her about this show where they were killing kids. So she basically gave them what they wanted without having seen the show. Then she watched it, and to be totally fair to her, she apologized.
I mean, I've always detested Mary Whitehouse. I've never liked her at all. Can't stand anybody like that. But I must say, in her defense, The whole thing was a classic tabloid setup. They very, very definitely gave not an inaccurate description, but a bad description of how Nightmare worked, and then cornered her with a presentation of it. And they missed out so many key details. And the most important detail they missed out was the business of Treguard stressing this poor kid who has been butchered mercilessly in the dungeon hasn't been butchered in reality. It's responsible broadcasting. It's important that that disclaimer is in there. They found a way to do it so that it doesn't quite break the illusion for the audience to the extent that it suddenly doesn't mean anything to them. But at the same time, it had to be in there, and they put it in there. And give Mary Whitehouse her due. As I say, it's very rare that she said or did anything that I ever agreed with, but she was grown up enough to hold up her hand and say, I was wrong. Full marks to her for that. It's the only time I will ever give her full marks is when discussing this. But full marks to her for that. She was able to say I was wrong. Well done for that.
Treguard bids farewell to the team and instructs them to take the scrolls placed on the rock next to them as proof of their short journey through the dungeon. Now, I have a theory that these scrolls are actually their release papers. Yeah, I was on Nightmare. I've got this release paper.
Yeah, well, they've been sent into a dungeon, but they're perfect release papers. They're probably not released. They're probably committal papers, because you take these papers. I want you to go to that nice person in the white coat over there and describe what you've just been doing. Oh, well, you see, I just went for a walk through a medieval dungeon, and I stepped on letters, and they opened a door for me, and then I got hold of this really huge ruby, which is far bigger than any ruby ever recorded by mankind, and I gave it to a really powerful sorceress, and she created this magic causeway out of nowhere that I walked across, and then I walked through this head of a snake, and it swallowed me down into this big corridor with a huge invisible army of people with huge walking towards me, and then I walked into this gigantic dark room, and an invisible monster drank my life force to death, and then I was brought back to life. They're going to commit you to the asylum if you say that to them, aren't they?
It almost sounds like, just turn me into a newt. I've got better.
Yes.
Do you know what? Screw Treguard. You should do the recaps at the beginning of each episode.
Oh my God. I don't know. I think I might, with this degree of sarcasm, I might just break the illusion a bit too much for the watchers. But yeah, I know what you mean. But yeah, this is, that's the thing. I could see them as committal papers rather than release papers, because if somebody came up to you and said all that, you would be calling the men in white coats, wouldn't you?
So, thoughts on the first team, and be kind-ish.
Now you've given me license. I mean, when Treguard says you did well, I do think it's a platitude. I think they did well only in the context of the fact that there had been no episodes before then, so they had nothing to learn from. If you take that in mind, you can say, yeah, that they did all right, but they only got to the end of level 1, and they didn't actually manage to get to the Wellway, or even though they got to the Wellway chamber. They did all right in the context of having no prior references to work on. If you compare them to later teams from later seasons, it's not fair to do it, I suppose. But if you do, it does get a bit embarrassing. Some of the manoeuvring was horribly slow, especially early on. They were going to leave the clue room without taking any objects, which even now makes me go a little bit. They tried they told him to just go through that door without guiding him through it at first. I thought, come on, guys, you must have got the hang of that much by now, haven't you? The clue object mistake they made that actually cost them. As I say, I think they were a little bit unlucky there. I thought, how were they supposed to know that they didn't need to carry it with them? If that clue object is important, you're not going to realise it. You don't take it with you.
I think that if they had got all 3 riddles right, Olgarth would have given them.
They might have got that, but so they're okay. I'm sure if they'd got to see earlier episodes of Nightmare, I'm sure they would have got. I would have expected them to get some way through the middle of level 2, but that would still mean they were mediocre. I'm not sneering at them. I think in that context, they would have got a bit further, but I don't think we can really see them as a serious threat to actually winning the whole thing.
Well, considering some of the Dungeoneers asked, "What should I say?" when they were asked their name.
Oh, they've definitely been worse. But you got to remember, it's not really the Dungeoneer who actually has to be the intelligent one. He just has to be the obedient one. He just has to be the responsive one. It's actually the advisors who have to be clever, because they're the ones who are actually making the decisions most of the time.
Oh, well, life goes on, or not, as they say, and there are still deeds to do before time flies. The dungeon wins and challenges still, but who shall be next to pick up the gauntlet? Enter, stranger.
Treguard wastes absolutely no time in bringing in our next team, which consists of Dungeoneer Maeve, along with advisors Christina, who was wearing a very snazzy tie, David, and Lee, who are all from Lancashire. You can definitely see at this point that Treguard does get some kind of enjoyment about the plight of his contestants, because he literally says to them, "Now that we have the next victims,
obviously scripted, but it's still very amusing, and it's an excellent immediate follow up to the "oh dear, what a pity, never mind" at the end of the previous quest. This is literally about a minute later.
I'd also like to point out that Maeve had a hairstyle here that can only be described as 1987, and that helmet is going to absolutely ruin it.
I don't know. It could very well be argued that it'll do about £50 of improvements. I don't know. So, there are some 80s hairstyles that I actually have quite a high approval of, but that's not one of them. Not that one.
We will get more into the advisors in the next episode. This is running very close to the end of the actual episode, and we don't really get much chance to experience them. We're given a quick reminder of how the Helmet of Justice, knapsack, and life force system work, and Treguard offers a word of warning in that the dungeon is obscure, so any knowledge of previous quests would be of little use. But they wouldn't have any knowledge of previous quests anyway.
I think episode 1 was televised shortly before they started filming episode 6. That's the conclusion I've drawn from listening to what they say at the time. But they seem to have certain knowledge. The final team of season 1 seem to have some knowledge of the first quest. That again is another of those speeches from Treguard that will have audiences hitting their heads against the wall by about episode 5, because he says it at the start of every single quest again. And again, there was just no need for it. That was actually, as I said before, that was actually a big problem with the first 2 seasons. I don't think Tim Child initially noticed.
Well, Maeve, are you ready to enter the quest?
Yes.
Very well. Turn then, face the dungeon door, and step forward.
Where am I? You're in a room with 4 doors, 2 in front and 1 on either side.
And Maeve steps out into exactly the same room as David started in, only this time the word they need to spell is sesame.
Given how long it took the previous bunch to figure out how to spell out open, just 4 letters. What the hell was Tim Child thinking, giving them a 7-letter war puzzle to do for the next one?
A 7-letter word that isn't in common usage.
Thankfully, this team appeared to be a little bit smarter. Thankfully, so they were able to actually work through it a lot more quickly. Oh my god!
They do work through it a lot quicker, but maneuverability still seems to be a bit of a weak point, and that will carry on, I think, for most of season 1 and 2. I don't think it's until series 3 until one of the production team just whispered in one of the advisors' ears, "You know they can step sideways, right?"
What I have found is definitely true is that teams in later seasons, I don't know if it was as early as season 3, but teams in later seasons had got into the habit of practicing maneuvering together before they actually started doing, before they actually appeared on TV. There was one team that won in season 6. They made clear years later on Nightmare.com, they actually said they practiced religiously for days and days before going to the studio with the Dungeoneer, with their chosen Dungeoneer actually wearing a blindfold, getting their instructions, getting their guidance. And so the movement was really fluid It really did. They were really able to move really, really convincingly.
I still maintain, had I been on the program, I would have been brilliant at maneuvering, because I was at the age where everyone played Nightmare in the playground.
Yes. That actually would have been excellent training, quite genuinely, for genuinely appearing on Nightmare. Whoever plays a Dungeoneer regularly, they're going to be used to being responsive whilst in a blindfold. And that is a trick. If you're not used to wearing a blindfold, it can actually be very, very difficult. The first thing you have to do is learn to trust the advisors, which you might find rather difficult to do. But if you've had plenty of practice doing things like that, even if it's just in the playground, you will actually be much better at maneuvering than somebody who's doing it for the first time just as the cameras start rolling. So, I'm pretty sure all of the teams in season 1 were basically, they were doing maneuvering completely fresh. And it's not good for them. And to be honest, it's not particularly good for the program.
Again, we really like this show.
It's like fans of Star Wars and fans of Doctor Who. You actually go on, they spend their entire time trashing everything that they've seen. We're doing it too.
No one hates Nightmare more than Nightmare fans.
Well, no, it's just we're the only ones who have an eloquent idea of what's wrong with the program. Other people just say really general things like, oh, but it looks really, really slow. Oh, those contestants are really, really bad actors. It's because they're not acting.
Warning, team. Complete temporal disruption approaching. Time is now the enemy. Oh, dear. Temporal disruption complete.
No sooner has Maeve's quest begun when temporal disruption takes place, and the team are frozen in time. Traegard tells us whilst time continues in our world, in theirs it's come to a standstill, and all adventuring must cease until next week. As a concept, I really liked the idea of temporal disruption.
It's really just finding a medieval stroke metaphysical way of saying, that's all for this week's show, folks. But they're trying to do it in a way that, once again, doesn't destroy the illusion completely. And by saying things like temporal disruption, or as it was later called, phase shift, you're talking in an interdimensional way, and therefore you're coming up with an excuse for all proceedings coming to a halt. During the first season, this was always done by just everything on the screen just suddenly freezing up. They made it more effective later by bringing in the chimes again. So it's the same chime that, I think it was the second episode of season 2 was when they started adding a chime whenever temporal disruption set in. And that could sometimes make you jump in your seat because you're thinking, oh God, has somebody just died? Oh no, no, it's just the end of the show. But that made it more effective. Just freezing up, it does feel like there's something missing. Once again, I have to gnash my teeth listening to that speech, because they literally, for the outro from every episode, they literally just replayed that same bit of tape for every episode except the final one of the season.
Well, it was at this point, of we watching it last night, that Kim pointed out to me there is quite clearly a penis above the fireplace.
I do not know what this says about your wife that she notices these things. I think that is something that I'm going to leave between you and her. But that's comes somewhat out of left field from where I was standing, but we're discussing temporal disruption. But yeah, the problem is I'm now going to be noticing that at the end of every single episode that we do a commentary on or do a podcast about.
Just in case anyone's a bit concerned, the penis in question is part of a statue, but you just see the penis.
When it appears in a fountain in Italy, everyone says it's art. So I'm just going to say it's art here, okay? I should say, on a serious note, this ending was basically another disclaimer, trying to make sure that they were broadcasting responsibly and emphasizing that what we were looking at was not actually real. A lot of it is surely an illusion. But it's also important, at the end of that, he finishes by saying,
join us again for Nightmare. And just keep telling yourself, it's only a game, isn't it?
And that "isn't it" is actually very, very effective. It doesn't get commented on often enough. It's very effective because it allows you to maintain the illusion in your head, because he's making it just a little bit ambiguous by saying, isn't it? These kids aren't really dying, are they? That chamber with spears coming in and out that are trying to skewer Dungeoneers, it's not really there, is it? It just allows the kids to stay immersed. If they want to feel If they want reassurance that it's not real and it's all just an illusion, well, there it is. He's giving you the reassurance. But if you aren't scared and you want to maintain the excitement of it, he's allowed you to maintain that as well by making it sound like his disclaimer might be true, it might not be.
Okay, and that was Temporal Discussion for this episode. I've been Martin Harder.
And I've been better. And I've been Martin O'Doney.
And we shall see you next time. And in the meantime,
Don't have nightmares.
Just watch them instead.
if you want to contact us, you can email us at broomcupboardclub@gmail.com. We'd especially like to hear from you if you've appeared on the show or worked behind the scenes. And remember, it's only a podcast.
Isn't it?